How to identify a bubble, in my opinion, is look at real traction. It's relatively easy to get people tweeting about you, talking about you. There's a lot of hype, but I feel like what separates like fluff from things that actually move the needle is, are these things actually being deployed and actually being embedded in workflows? A lot of people like use ChatGPT once or twice, tweet about how cool it was, and like never come back to it again. Unless you get embedded into workflows, it's gonna become a passing trend.
Welcome to the Startup Huddle. I'm your host, Josef Maruščák, and I'm excited to introduce you to the current and upcoming leaders of the startup tech world. We'll discuss digital products and key takeaways for life and professional growth. So grab a coffee and let's huddle up.
Hi everyone. So on today's episode, we have here Zach Rattner, from the founder of Yembo.ai, also a recent author of a book focused on the recent AI developments, also focused on his entrepreneurial journey and on the early stage founders. So I guess that most of our listeners will find what they're looking for here. Hi, Zach, and thanks very much for joining us.
Hi, Joseph. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So to start, tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit more about your background, about the current company, because you've been around the AI space for 7 years now, if I'm not mistaken. And tell us also a little bit more about how you get to writing a book.
Sure. So I am a software engineer by training. I have about 15 years overall experience doing that. And I founded Yembo in 2016 and set out to do that to bring the advancements in computer vision and AI technology into a market that seemed to be underserved in the home services space. So we build computer vision technology and we package it up in a software solution that moving companies and property insurance companies can use. And we shrink down the kind of long and tedious quoting time down to just a few minutes. And we do that by allowing customers to take quick videos of the items in their home that need to be serviced. So for instance, if you're moving, it's typically everything you own needs to be identified to be able to get an accurate quote. And we build technology that allows the moving company to have a more streamlined conversation. So we do things like estimating how many packing materials it would take to pack a room. And the sales agent is able to have a more kind of collaborative conversation. And they don't have to ask as many questions around like, how many boxes do you need for this? And we allow the AI to work kind of alongside a human being to have a better overall experience. And doing this for 7 years, I've learned a lot of things, both good and bad, things that worked, things that didn't work. And that was the genesis behind the book, was I felt like there's just so much happening in AI today that I wanted to encourage people to not sit idly on the sidelines, but to try it out. There's so many things that you can do, even if you're not a AI researcher yourself, in terms of using what's available out there. And I think of it really like the internet in the early 90s. Like, just, you don't want to sit by the sidelines and just watch everybody else kind of sort everything out. So the book is called Grow Up Fast, Lessons from an AI Startup. And it's organized sort of as just individual lessons that I've learned along the way around developing a product, around shipping AI, around making sure that the AI is achieving a goal for the person. In our world, the customer has to want to use it because there are alternatives. So AI isn't just like an end all be all. It's kind of a means to an end. So how do you wrap your head around that and make something that is actually valuable to the end user? And really excited to finally be able to bring it out into the world. It took about 10 times longer to finally get over the finish line than I had initially anticipated. So it feels pretty good to finally be done.
So how long did it take you to write your book? And when is it due? When you are releasing it?
The book is out on August 1st, so a couple days away. And it took about a year. And we treated it, I treated it sort of like a product, where when you make a software product, you have some hypotheses around who your target audience is and what they're interested in and what problem they're trying to solve. So I kind of started with that, and it didn't take too long to get the first draft. It was maybe like a month or two. And I thought, okay, cool, wow, bang that out. That was pretty good. So I kind of blocked some time in the morning before work each day and just kind of forced myself to sit down and write. And when you're getting ready to launch a software product, there's this common thing where you do focus groups and you share it with a small group of people and you get feedback on it. And in the software world, you'll say, like, on a scale from 1 through 5, how would you rate my product? So in the book, I said on a scale from 1 through 5, if you had to rate what you just read on Amazon today, what would you do? And my initial draft got me a whopping 2.8 out of 5. So I figured I had some work to do. And it was really interesting, like listening to feedback. And what I learned when I was doing that was that people weren't so interested in like an AI textbook. They don't want it to be super technical. It's more about how do you make the AI relevant to a certain market, to deliver it in a product, and how do you manage all the complexities around that. So we kind of deleted a lot of things, added in different parts, and repeated that process. And in the last round that we did, we came back with 4.8, and I figured, okay, that perfection cannot be attained. 4.8 is good enough. Let's go for it.
And what was the focus group that you were trying to get the reviews from? So how large of a feedback you need to get compared to a software product, you think, when you're writing a book?
I think it really depends on the size of the audience that you're going after. So for the book, it's a pretty broad audience. I mean, our product is like one particular industry, and we're focusing on a particular workflow within that industry. But with the book, I wanted it to be relevant to people who had never written a line of code before, people who maybe had been software engineers but were interested in going into the AI space. I wanted it to be relevant to folks that make decisions and sit on a lot of data at larger companies, but maybe don't know how to bring AI into it yet. So we did a couple different targeted campaigns, and we tried to get around each wave we would do. We tried to get about a dozen people within that category. We tried a couple different things with in the software world at Yembo, and we found if you go too much past a dozen, you kind of stop learning new things. You keep hearing the same feedback over and over again. And if you go too much less than that, if you just ask like one person, then you overfit, and it's like one person didn't like this chapter, so now I have to delete it. So we found like kind of 8 to 12 is that sweet spot.
That makes kind of sense. Like we also like do a lot of product discovery in Sudolabs, and we sort of came to a very, very similar conclusion that it's very interesting how, like, once you reach that critical mass, which is most of the time a lot less than people would expect, you start getting the same feedback. Then you know that you've chosen your target persona, right? So
Exactly.
people
Yeah.
have like sort of similar interests and similar values and all that kind of stuff. So very, very interesting. In terms of so I suggest, or I expect that there are quite a lot of people that would like to write their own book, and people coming from entrepreneurial background in startups with different stories. How hard it is to do so if you're like not a writer? What would you say? Like, what are the key things you need to go through, except for the validation and for understanding your target audience?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest impediment to writing a book, at least for me, the biggest one I faced was ego. I mean, I've been writing software all day, every day for better half of 15 years now, and I'm not that good at writing a book initially. I had to learn a lot of things. So, like being willing to take that gut punch and get your 2.8 out of 5, and really not kind of shut down, but listen to the feedback, understand what's resonating, what's not. I do love to read. I'm an avid. You can see this is half the bookshelf behind me. I've got another half off camera. But I feel like being able to succinctly communicate your point and get it across and have it like the right thing come out is certainly an art. And I think I've improved over the past year of working on doing this. But I think starting without like a firm deadline in mind and not like forcing myself to be done by a certain amount of time and kind of giving some room to that creative process was really key. I think if I had just given myself a really tight deadline, it would have probably stressed me out. I would have given up. But being able to kind of like let it take some time and see how it goes. There's a lot of mulling involved. I think with software, you usually define the problem, you sit down, you write the code, you test it, it works. But with the book, I went on a lot of walks where it's like, I don't know if I have a feeling about this chapter. Let me just take a walk around the block and see if I still think this is a good idea. And I don't think there's really a way to like speed that up.
How much writing of a book is about the actual content in terms of your success? Obviously, that needs to be the necessary part, but how much it is about the way how you write? So, like, did you take any courses or any? How did you approach learning that writing style part?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we I write a lot. not in the same format, but I mean, we're a remote company, so written communication generally is really important. We have remote teams, and a lot of folks start working their day when it's like 9, 10 o'clock at night for me. So I think the act of writing is something that I do somewhat frequently. But for the book, um, I think I write talk about this a bit in the book as well. But being mindful of what you don't know is I hadn't done this before, and I felt like I had interesting lessons to share from, I mean, talking to folks at work and mentees and things like that. Like I've I've been through some things that I felt like were helpful and worth talking about, but I didn't know how to write a book. So I worked and found an editor to be able to bounce some ideas off of. And I think that was, in hindsight, like one of the wisest decisions is like having somebody else who does know what they're doing, who fills in that gap for you, and you can bounce ideas off of and get feedback, that you don't have to just do things in a vacuum by yourself. Um, and then doing that with, I think, the right mindset of going in and saying, I'm doing something for the first time. You've been doing this for quite some more time. Can you, like, don't gloss over things if you feel like I'm doing something that you disagree with. Like, give me that feedback. And again, I see a lot of parallels between the software world and writing the book. But if I build a user interface and don't do any user studies and I just say, here it is, it's amazing, and the customer comes back and tells me, no, it's not, you're not going to make a great product. But if you have humility and you really listen to where your customers are coming from and what they're looking to do, and you don't have to directly address every single negative feedback point, but to kind of go in with the right mindset of like kind of asking to learn. I think that mentality definitely carried over where you kind of assume the first copy of everything you do is just a draft and that it's open to be updated, as opposed to like just assuming you made the Mona Lisa because it's your first draft and you finished.
Yeah, and the book is essentially focusing on helping the early stage founders, if I understand it correctly, and but generally the public to better understand the current stage of AI, but also to teach them or help them, you know, how to build first AI product or products in general. Am I right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because I feel like there's so much data that a lot of companies are sitting on that they might not even realize the value or how accessible it is to do something interesting with that. Um, I mean, we were talking about the audiobook narration earlier, and like the tools that we're looking at, like half of these things are like incorporated in the last few months. It's like there's so many things that are happening all of a sudden that if you thought about AI like 3, 4, 5 years ago and you said, "Here, what can it do? What can it do?" And if that's still what's in your head, it's out of date. I'm a practitioner in the field. I have an AI company, and I even struggle with keeping up with how many things are going on out there. I feel like every time I open LinkedIn, there's like a list of 100 new tools that I don't know how the person who posted it had the time to go try them all out. But it's just there's so much available now that was completely impossible before, and the world is like still kind of grappling with it. So here's one thing that kind of scares me a little bit. Um, Over the weekend, I had an issue. I was on a road trip and I went to swipe my card to pay for gas, and the bank declined the card because they thought it was fraud because I wasn't in my hometown. So I called the bank and they asked me to give some details. But the last step before they agreed to like have a banker talk to me was they had me voice verify myself. So they gave me a phrase and they told me repeat this. And we had just been looking into voice cloning generally for the audiobook. And like we're living in a world right now where for like $5 a month you can have a tool that voice clones, and also that's how the biggest banks verify your identity. So it's like this state that we're in today isn't going to last forever. It's like this transient blip where just so much has changed at once that I feel like everybody's trying to digest it and react with it. And when ChatGPT came out a few months ago, everyone was wondering like, how do I use it in my workflow? And there's a lot of different things it does well, things it doesn't do well, where people are trying to learn. But I think the key here is everything is kind of up for grabs right now, and there are a lot of people that are needing to define these things just because it's the first time going through it. That I feel like it's one of the most interesting, creative, wealth generating opportunities of our generation. That for the first time, there's this huge transformative shift with technology making something available, and kind of a great horizontal equalizer. There's a lot of different areas that are being disrupted by it. And we're all trying to figure it out. I mean, regulators are trying to figure out how to regulate it. Practitioners are trying to figure out where things work well and where they don't. And it's just a very like vibrant time to be alive and to be practicing in the field.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. So not only the consumers are struggling with actually understanding what's on the market, what's feasible, what works, what doesn't work, what brings value and what doesn't bring value, but also like larger enterprises, regulators, governments, everything seems to be sort of all around the place right now. And
Hmm.
but what's interesting about your profile is that you've been working in AI for quite some time. It's been 7 years, right, at least.
Hmm.
So if you can maybe tell us a little bit more about how you see the world right now compared to what it was 7 years ago when you were building the AI product. When I can say it was not as cool as it is right now
Sure.
to use AI. So what exactly happened, and why there is such a boom currently with all the AI products?
Sure. I feel like, in short, people seem to catch on to what's possible now. So let me tell you about the inciting incident that made Yembo possible. So there was this academic benchmark, and it was kind of obscure. It was called ImageNet, and it's you can think of it like a 1,000-way multiple choice test. So if I hold up a picture and ask you like, what is this of? It's very easy for a human to say, oh, that's a cat sitting on a sofa, or that's a dog, or that's a barn, or something like that. And what the ImageNet competition was it was a challenge for algorithms to do that. So research arms out of companies, universities would submit their algorithms, and they would compete. So they'd compete by having data that was labeled by humans that would go through it and kind of write down the answers. But then they wouldn't tell you the answers; they'd show the picture, and then you'd have to run your code and say what it was of. And in 2015, Microsoft submitted a solution that won, and it crossed a threshold where humans were benchmarked and they were about 95% accurate. So you take like a typical like college educated person and you show them 100 examples, they'll get about 95 of them right. So for the first time in history, the best object detection algorithms were better than people at identifying items and images. It kind of like blew my mind. I was like, this is going to change everything, right? Like nobody seems to know this yet. And you went on news articles, and people didn't really seem to be talking about it that much. And a lot of the fundamental technology and like algorithms that went into that kind of evolved and continued to grow, and led us to where we are today. And I feel like there's just as much innovation, probably more innovation happening today than there was then in the space. But the public seems to have kind of caught on and realized that when these discoveries are made, it's not like a bunch of academics in a corner that are kind of shielded off from mainstream society are the only ones talking about it anymore. So I feel like the time to adoption has shrunk somewhat dramatically. That something interesting happens, like it gets deployed and people see it pretty quickly.
Very interesting. But wasn't the problem, so sort of the assumption in all the digital products is that when something brings value, like people adopt it, right?
Hmm.
So what was the problem? Like where most of the is it that the technology changed so much that right now actually there are consumers that are able to benefit from the AI product, or was it simply that before that the companies and the people didn't realize the full potential of the AI? I'm just saying that because I would assume that mostly there's so much funding going into the AI
Hmm.
product as well. And I would say that if there was actually a potential for a disruptive technology in the AI space, VCs would invest in that, and like founders would search there. So
Hmm.
it's sort of somehow weird to see that now like one generative AI was released, like we are talking about ChatGPT, and
Hmm.
suddenly the whole world shifted. So where's that shift coming from?
Well, I think the fundamental discoveries, like in the science realm, like papers that come out, they don't have very good user interfaces. So like it'll be like that paper that I was talking about where Microsoft won. I mean, you can read it. They talk about their error rates. They show all these plots, but like as a layperson, you can't really do a whole lot with it. And I feel like the best AI projects are really humanities problems. Like they understand a workflow or something that a customer wants to do, and the interface around it, the software around it, you need to design, and that takes time to do. Um, the interesting part about a lot of these AI technologies is they benefit from parallel computing. So it's not just like a standard computer, but these high-end graphics processors are really powerful and um, almost necessary in a lot of use cases. So it's not just like you can read the paper and go do something. In a lot of cases, you have to actually go build physical hardware. So if you're a company trying to build a product around it, the tooling and all the best practices around user interfaces are kind of matured. That makes it easier for that next step to happen when there's a big discovery that's made. In our early days, we I didn't do a great job on this, so I can give you a quick example. So with detection algorithms, everything is probability based. So you and I would look around a room and say, oh, there's a coffee table in the middle, but that's not exactly how a convolutional neural network will do it. In the deep learning world, you would look at it and say, I'm like 92% certain that's a coffee table, or I'm 41% certain that's a coffee table. It's just nature of how the thing works. And we were really proud. I trained my first model. I was like, cool, we finally got this thing working. So I exposed that number in the actual product. So you could like click on the item that got detected and it's like, I'm 81% sure this is a lamp. Turns out that really confuses the end user who's like, hey, I just want to know what's there, what's not there. So like, what's with this percentage? It doesn't really help me with anything. So like, it took us time to realize that the output of what like the core technology is capable of isn't like every little data point is immediately applicable in the end user's scenario. We had to think through, what do they care about? What is the AI capable of doing? And how do we bridge that gap? That we don't even take on a project today unless a designer is present from day one, just thinking about the human factors, because they're so critical. If I just publish a paper and say, look at this thing that's possible now, like unless you give a way for somebody to do something with that, it doesn't really move the needle in terms of like workflow adoption.
So it seems like the whole tech world actually moved forward also in terms of the product management and the UI UX and the way how we generally approach building products, right? And that allowed also for the general AI to be able to, generally for the AI to be able to access the market.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at when smartphones came out, that also kicked up this wave of disruption where user interface design and best practices had to be all revisited. So we can go to web pages on our phones, we can go to web pages on our desktops, and there were things like the hover state. When you move your cursor over a button, they can like change color to let you know that it's clickable. But on a phone, you can't do that because you don't have a cursor. So there were all these like paradigms that we had to reinvent and kind of figure out because this new technology came along, and the old world that it came into wasn't like perfectly compatible with it. So we had to upgrade a few things. And I feel like AI is doing the same thing, is it kind of takes time to figure out what are these best practices around deploying these models and what are the software tools around it. And it was funny. I when we were trying to hire initially, when we had that first product, had the core AI technology ready and the initial version of the interface, we didn't have any designers. I just kind of did it myself. And we were looking for people, did the typical job description thing, right? You write down what you need, say like how many years of experience. And we realized we were asking for years of experience in areas that hadn't been around for years yet. So it was difficult to find people. But I feel like now the space has matured more and people have thought through these kinds of things that you could probably lay out some best practices around things like voice detection or object detection or disclosures around when generative AI is used, that the public has kind of like thought through it enough that there are certain expectations around what it should and shouldn't be able to do, that it takes time to digest these kinds of things and figure out what people's stances are on them.
So from everything you say, it seems to be that you really believe that the AI is the next big thing and it's going to fundamentally change the way how we live probably, and it will shape the society. Now, there's a lot of people claiming that, you know, what's happening right now on the VC market and on the startup market, generally speaking, is another bubble. So do you think it's true? And if not, like, what's the, for example, difference between what we are experiencing right now and what we have experienced like a few years ago with Web3 and blockchain?
Sure. So I think how to identify a bubble, in my opinion, is look at real traction. I mean, it's relatively easy to get people tweeting about you, talking about you. There's a lot of hype, but I feel like what separates like fluff from things that actually move the needle is, are these things actually being deployed and actually being embedded in workflows? A lot of people like use ChatGPT once or twice, tweet about how cool it was, and like never come back to it again. So I think that's unless you get embedded into workflows, it's going to become a passing trend. And that's why I feel like overall, now any one particular startup, maybe there's certainly interest in the space. So I think people will go and tout their new wares and all these kinds of things. But I feel like as an engineer, when there's a technical differentiation in the product, that's like one big standout. So a lot of these companies that are just like API layers on top of OpenAI APIs, like I don't see a ton of innovation there. But I feel like getting the AI technology deployed and embedded in a workflow, that's where it's going to have real transformative effects, because you'll be able to do things like basically give people superpowers. We actually got one of our first customers internationally, because when you're moving internationally, if you operate a moving company, you usually don't have people all over the world. So you have a headquarters, and if someone's doing a move to another country, you usually partner with another firm in that country. So I'll pack and load it up in the US, and maybe you in the UK are unpacking it. So my company works with yours. And when you have the Yembo quote, we actually put the pictures of the items that are there that are moving. And that's what we pass along to say, like, here's the inventory list. So we did that for a client on the East Coast here in the US. They did a move overseas, and the people unpacking were like, who has the time? We got this email and it was like, who has the time to watch videos and pull all these things out? But it was really helpful for them, because they got to understand, like, if I just say, hey, there's a sofa, you might not know like what it looks like, what condition it's in, all that kind of stuff. So having the picture is helpful. But we gave them the ability to do something that would be completely infeasible if you didn't have AI. And we packaged it up in a way that made them actually take less time than they were doing before. And I feel like there are so many use cases like that, where this is just one in one particular industry, but there's just a lot of things that are up for grabs, and you can make something that is easier to use, better to understand, higher fidelity, and overall less effort. And I feel like that's where a lot of this innovation is going to come from. There's like the transformative spark when the algorithm becomes possible, but then all the different applications that come from that kind of take some time to trickle through. And that's what we're seeing happen right now in the startup landscape.
Yeah, so essentially you say that the main difference between what was happening before and now compared to like blockchain is that there's actually like real use cases with added value for AI. And not only that, but also people and companies actively implement those solutions, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think there was a lot of speculation around people would buy up tokens because they were basically buying lottery tickets. And it didn't actually translate to real world usage. So a lot of these companies, they do the ICO and generate some hype, and people would buy up the tokens, and then that project a lot of times like didn't go forward. Not all of them were like outright scams. I think a lot of them were well intentioned, but they just weren't able to get traction for one reason or another. But in this case, it feels different because it's like happening all around you. I feel like I used to tell people 4 or 5 years ago, like, oh, you probably use AI and you don't even know it. But now like everybody knows it, right? It's not like a hidden thing anymore. So it's getting harder and harder to avoid.
Yes, but also, as in every whether it's a hype cycle or not, like a hype cycle in the negative sense of meaning, there is definitely like incredible amount of funding, an incredible amount of innovation happening in a very short time span. So and that brings along problems with products are being released and then they die.
Mm-hmm.
Products are like claim they do something which is not necessarily true, or you adopt certain technology and then next month you have a new one. So how would you help? What would you suggest is the best way how to navigate yourself in the current environment, both for the consumers, where I think the risk is smaller, but for
Mm-hmm.
enterprises and for larger companies, like how do they know which technologies to adopt that are on the market, and how to discover what is even on the market right now with so much happening so quickly?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing I'd say is I don't think a hype cycle is necessarily bad. I would say mobile computing in the 2010s was a hype cycle. The internet in the 90s was a hype cycle. And yeah, there was a lot of buzz, but if you look take a long enough view and look back, I don't think we're worse off for those inventions. Now, it's easy to get kind of caught up in the midst of things in the interim time, but I think there is like a real benefit that has happened with these algorithms being possible now. But then how do you cut through all the noise? I think is the issue, or how do you work with the right firms? And I have a view, it's a possibly biased view as an engineer, but I feel like technical innovation should be at the key of it, that you can't really control what you don't understand. So companies that make their whole business model around um, like wrapping their technology around something else, I feel like you don't really have the ability to go that last mile. So if you if you're not able to cook up your core technology yourself as a company, I feel like that's going to be a competitive disadvantage. Um, we looked at in our when we were starting, there are tools out there that you can like pay Google Cloud or some other companies to identify objects, and we uploaded a couple images, and it would say like indoor. And like, okay, but I need to know like how many chairs, how many lamps, how many TVs. But like if you just hitch your wagon to, oh, this is easy to get started, you can make some progress. But I feel like in terms of like evaluating, do I want to partner with this company? It's like really look at the team, look at the underlying technology. Do they have something real, or do they have good just like graphics and marketing materials, but under the hood it's all like repackaged version of something else? I think it's relatively easy to put something together, but to make something that's lasting is a bit more complicated.
And when we are at the topic of it's relatively easy to start something right now, and then we can see it on the market, right? So in the AI space, you have new products, essentially completely new companies, and new products being released in like 4 to 6 weeks, with like
Mm-hmm.
crazy valuation sometimes. So it seems to be relatively easy to start new products in the AI space. Why it is so?
Well, there's a lot of interest in this space, as you mentioned. So it's an interesting way to kind of get people interested in your product. But there's also a lot of tooling available, and a lot of these companies that are out there also oftentimes startups themselves have APIs that they're offering, services that they're offering that make it easy to like embed AI into your workflow. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think I would rather live in a world where there are too many products using something, where there's like versus one where there's like one or two powerful folks that have a monopoly on it. So I think it does make a lot of things to sift through. Maybe you can ask ChatGPT to summarize the best ChatGPT plugins. But I feel like it's good to experiment. It's good to try things, and it's good to have people be able to put something together. I think that's pretty interesting, right? That like if you have an idea and a couple of free weekends that you can put something together and actually have like a working viable thing that you can go and have people use, that's like it's cool. But I feel like where things go wrong is if you overextend it, and if people purport to do, they claim to be able to do things that they can't actually do. That's where things get dicey. But I feel like it's it's kind of invigorating waking up in the morning and trying. I think I've probably signed up for like 15 or 20 different things this week, just like trying out all these different tools that are coming up. And yeah, I think overall it's good. It's a sign of a vibrant ecosystem. So it's AI brings a lot of powerful things, makes them all possible. But I'm generally, at the end of the day, I'm an optimist about it all. I feel like these things can be used for good, and with the right people around, then I think it will.
And so you're generally have a very, very positive mindset towards the AI innovation. What would you say for somebody who is trying to start an AI company or a company in an AI space? What is the biggest challenge? What's the hardest part about it?
Well, lots of things are hard. I would say understanding your target market and what their real needs are. There are, you mentioned before about user studies and things like that, but there are perceived needs and then actual needs. So really understanding the thing that your AI is going to augment. There's some workflow, some process, some way that people are doing things today without AI, and really understanding what that is and how AI is going to improve it. And then I'd encourage people from the get-go, you're going to get asked, think about the stakeholders. If there's a certain element that's getting disrupted, then kind of thinking through how do we make this something that is beneficial to everybody. So in our world, we had a lot of pushback in our early days where people didn't understand that this was a tool to help the sales agents. People were like nervous about, is this going to take my job? But now that we have some deployments under our belt, we can actually demonstrate, we have data, we have case studies, we can show, no, this doesn't take away your job. It frees you up to go win more business. You can grow your company. You can be more efficient, and it allows you to do more in a day. But it doesn't replace, right? The AI isn't building rapport with the customer, it's doing the back office bits. So I think like thinking through who's going to be affected by this and how can we make it like awesome for all stakeholders, and thinking through these kinds of things in the early days while you're putting it all together is the right time to do it. If you haven't thought about it and you've already shipped, it's too late. So I feel like a lot of the like urgency to go build, people sometimes forget to be thoughtful and they forget to think about the stakeholders, and I think that can derail some things sometimes.
The stakeholder management is a very, very interesting point you just mentioned. I actually before co-founding Sudolabs, I also was involved in an AI startup in the legal space actually, and
Mm-hmm.
sort of there seems to be quite a big pushback from essentially all the lawyers, and I think that the main point was, that the product was in the AI prediction space, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone was sort of fearing that AI is somehow going to replace their jobs, and there were these media booms about the robot lawyers and all that
Mm-hmm.
kind of stuff, and I think that the market, the pushback you are getting from the market, if the market is scared of some particular innovation and doesn't understand it properly, can actually like kill your product, especially in the more conservative markets.
Mm-hmm.
So very good pointing out the fact that when you're building something, it's also about like understanding and communicating well to the stakeholders what's the purpose.
Exactly, yeah. Understanding and communicating, and then like factoring the decisions in. So I think in a lot of these like AI text generation use cases, it's trained on a corpus of existing data and like thinking through what is that data. It doesn't really reason. It's just looking at like what are likely next words given the previous sequence of words. So you can't really do something inherently new with that. So I think there are certain legal use cases that might make a lot of sense, but like understanding the limitations of that technology. And that's what I meant when I said like overextending, not trying to go say, hey, we can write a new company's constitution using this AI thing. And like it may not realize the nuance that it really goes into doing a good job with that. But there are certain things around like, I don't know, searching that might be easier, or these other kind of maybe more incremental building blocks. But I think thinking through those kinds of things and not trying to bite off like an impossible use case, given what the technology is capable of, is kind of where that Goldilocks zone lies.
And we touched many times validation during our talk already. So imagine you are like a founder in the AI space, you have 5 different ideas. How would you go about validating them? And when would you say is the point where you can claim, okay, like I can actually achieve a product market fit with that idea?
Sure. So I think it's great to have ideas. I feel like at a startup, you're almost always execution constrained, where you have more ideas than you have bandwidth to actually go do. So if you have five, I think you're right. You need to think like probably get it down to one that you actually go focus on. Um, and when you go and do that, thinking through what the metrics are. So we always like to kind of work backwards when we're starting a new product, and we'll think about, okay, if this thing works well, what would I like to see happen next? And oftentimes, it's not the numbers themselves that really matter. It's like I want like X daily active users or Y dollars of revenue, but it's more kind of thinking about what that adoption would look like, and can you get your first champion? I think people always talk about like big scale and they want to go from idea to a million users. And sure, that's great. You should do that, certainly. But I feel like step one is can I win over one person? Have my first customer like be fanatical and love the product? Do a really good job there, and then kind of going out. So I think this idea of product market fit, I see a lot of folks trying to go too fast, too wide, and then like the day that you have your MVP live is probably not the best day to go blow a bunch on Google Ads and try to get a million people to use it. Like try to get your first, like understand really well who your target market is. Go find 10, 1,500 like those people. Trade shows can be good uses of that because people generally have the same like industry background. They all gather together. There's multiple ways you can do it, but finding that target group and then like really see if the product resonates, going in there with that open mindset. Don't assume that it's going to be 100% perfect on day one. I mean, iPhone took a couple of years to get copy paste. So it's like not every single feature that people ask for, you're going to, they may come back with complaints when you launch, but kind of working with them to the point where you have people that are real supporters then I feel like it almost becomes like obvious if you go that way, if you have product market fit or not. I found too, when people come back with critical feedback, it's almost always a signal of buy-in more than hypotheticals. And we chat about this a bit in the book, but I can give an example is like if I launch a new feature and you aren't really bought in, you like understand it and you're a customer, but you're using another part of the product, and maybe just out of generosity of your time, you got on the call with me, you might just rattle off a few ideas. It'd be cool if the product did this, did that, did the other thing. But if you really grappled with it and tried to use it and went deep, you're going to have gripes, right? You're going to be like, hey, this phone should copy paste. I want to be able to copy paste. You'll have these use cases where you tried to do it and you like ran past the boundary of what the technology can do. And that will frustrate you because you want it to work. So at first I used to think when people would email me feedback after we launched something and there was negative feedback, I took it kind of critically. I was like, oh no, we messed up. But I realized then it's actually a signal of buy-in. Like they're trying to make it work. Whereas someone who never really tried to make it work didn't get frustrated about that. They don't have anything to gripe about because they didn't really use it. So that it takes time. So like launching the product and then having time in your schedule. Don't just move on to like cranking out more features. Like actually take the time. If a customer played around with your product for a few days and wants to have like a 2-hour call with you, like take that. It's valuable. And I feel like kind of laying it out in that way where you can have that time to digest the feedback is a real good way to see if it's going to work out or not.
And how would you go about getting the feedback from the customers? So what do you think are the best methods? Does it depend? Obviously, it will depend on the industry, on the type of product, but
Sure.
people normally, when you say feedback, people imagine user interviews.
Mm-hmm.
What are the other ways how you can go about it?
Well, feedback comes in all kinds of forms. I mean, the user interviews certainly works. That's my favorite personally because you can pick up on like subtle things like body cues, or if people are like checking their phone while they're talking to you, like they're telling you this isn't super important, even though like they may not be saying it with words. But there's more to that than you can do. I mean, there's also you can at the end of an interaction ask, how was that experience? I think like Google Maps and Amazon, they do a good job with this. Like Google Maps has done how many navigations, like how many people has it gotten from point A to point B, and they still ask at the end of every one, how did we help you find the right door? How was your overall experience? Do you have any suggestions? Like they've never assumed that they've got it. They still ask for that kind of feedback. So I think like building that into the product, like asking for feedback at critical junctures, and making sure that each workflow that you're like interested in monitoring, you're asking a question there. And that's one thing that you can do. You can also have analytics, so you can see like if people tell you they love the feature, but they're spending 3 seconds on the page, maybe they don't love it too much. So we try to instrument our products with enough that if something were to be like going wrong, I don't want to have to be dependent on you like calling me and complaining. So I feel like blending all these different sources and then using the user interviews as like a component of it is like part of a overall robust like feedback strategy.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. I think you also need to be quite creative in trying to understand your customers depending on the product. You also need to know probably when do you have enough feedback. So what is the critical mass? Like we talked about user interviews there, you said like between 8 to 12. In terms of like more consumer facing products, where do you think you should in that, because as we touched upon, the best way how to build product is to constantly be getting feedback. Now,
Right.
how do you know that you have enough feedback already, and when you should simply move on and jump, into building the new feature or into actually telling yourself that you are heading in the right direction?
I would say, and this may not be a great answer if you want like a number, enough to be convinced. So if you were to tell your co-founder, stakeholder, someone, we need to go in this direction, and they say why, you should be able to have a compelling narrative. So if you are able to get that after 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 user interviews, great. If you have like maybe your background or your knowledge, you have conviction where you maybe don't feel the need to test a certain area. I feel like the hardest thing to do is it's a ton of work to do a startup, and the hardest thing to do is grinding it out if you're not convinced that you're like on a mission that's worth pursuing. So I think the order number one is convince yourself, and don't try to play games with yourself, but try to like honestly convince yourself that you're in the right direction. And that's kind of how I ended up at that 8 to 12 number. Is if I talk to the 13th, 15th, 20th person, it's not like it's bad per se, but the narrative that I have in my head around why a customer would want to use this isn't really changing anymore. Like I'm not getting any new signal anymore, and that's where I cut it off. So if you've not done it before, don't just take my word for it and go do 8. Go until you stop learning. And if I had to guess, I'd guess you'd end up around 8, but your mileage may vary. So I feel like doing enough to convince yourself is really the key.
That that sounds very reasonable. Obviously, it's going to be different for everyone else, but I also understand that it's very hard to give like a all working solution to different problems. So that makes sense. Let's maybe go. I would like to cover 2 more areas here.
Sure.
One is like the future of Yembo, where you are, where you're heading, what you maybe need to achieve your goals. And but before that, I would like to jump maybe into like your overall entrepreneurial experience. So, what do you think in those 7 years are the key takeaways from your entrepreneurial journey? Both like maybe your key learnings, and then if you can jump into like the biggest fail and maybe the happiest moment.
Sure. So I think one of the big lessons and key takeaways is when I started out, I would evaluate how ready I was to do something. Like I had the idea to do a startup in concept for a while, like in high school. I knew at some point, like it seemed cool. You're reading about like the Google founders and the Apple story, and like it seemed interesting. But there's like a moment that you have to like decide, okay, is this like a fantasy that I'm living in? Do I actually want to do this? And I used to, in those earlier days, judge if I'm ready or not by like what I had accomplished already. And I don't do that anymore. What I do now is I judge if I'm able to go in a certain area based on like my problem solving skills. And that means I don't have to have done something before to like trust that I would be able to do a good job in that going forward. Because I think what happens when you do a startup is you are thrown into weird situations you haven't dealt with before, like all day, every day. And what happens after enough reps of doing that is you start getting pretty good at identifying and fixing problems. And that workflow isn't just like, oh, well, I can handle operations, or I can handle shipping, or I can handle logistics. It's like I can go into an ambiguous situation with multiple stakeholders and I can figure it out, and I can like put a process together and make this thing work well. And I feel like that's one of the biggest areas about like growing up on the entrepreneurial space is like not second guessing myself just because I hadn't literally done that thing before. But to get there, like you mentioned, biggest fails, like there's a lot of things that we tried that some things work out great and some things don't. I think one of the biggest fails that I did early on where we were Yembo.ai. So we wanted to make sure we had amazing AI technology. Like it's kind of the core premise. I talked about like not using wrappers around other things. Like I really believe that. But in our early days, I completely discounted almost everything else. So we had our AI that we built. We didn't have a design team. We didn't have software team. It was Yembo.ai, right? Not Yembo software, Yembo design. And what happened was we had some absolutely horrible user flows. Like the core technology was really cool, but we had like scenarios where it might take like an hour or two more to use Yembo than to do it the alternative way. And fortunately, we fixed it pretty quickly, and we realized like what we had done. But kind of just like assuming if I make cool technology, the rest is just kind of come along. It was a faulty assumption, and that's why I mentioned now we don't start a new project unless there's a designer present like on that team kicking it off. But we initially, when the customer scans a video, we would reduce it down to images, and we'd show them the images one at a time because that was relatively easy to implement. It's kind of the underlying technology worked that way, so it kind of made sense. Show you a picture, next. The problem is sometimes an image is in, or an item is in multiple images. So then you have to kind of remember, I see a TV here. Was that the same TV as the picture before? But I'm actually showing you the picture before. So it's causing all this people flipping back and forth and like getting confused. I think if we had just asked like one customer, can you try this out? We could have saved ourselves some embarrassment. But we didn't. So we shipped it and then just quickly rolled it right back and then updated it and shipped out something again later. But I think just like keeping that in mind, that the technology is like an engine, but people don't buy engines. Usually they buy cars. So you have to think about how does it get packaged and what's the experience like and all those kinds of things. And then in terms of highs, there's like interesting stuff that's happening every day. I would say our expansion internationally was pretty interesting because I mentioned we didn't really plan for it to happen, but one thing just kind of led to another, and then we had to kind of figure that bit out. So that brought along problems like translations. German words are a lot longer character for character than American words. So like we had to revisit some parts of our interface where it looked great in English, but then in German, everything was getting cut off. But like being able to see the core technology go to places that I had never been, I just thought that was like really cool and really interesting about like, we kind of started off selling to companies in our own backyard. And then when Yembo had gone, I had this like, I think I just woke up, it was like super early, maybe like 3:30, 4 in the morning. And I realized this product that we thought so long about, that we've been working so hard on for so long, there are people that I've never met who live in places that I've never been that are depending on it. It was just like a cool thought. And then I couldn't go back to sleep and got excited. And I don't remember what I did next, but like when things are working, it's just like, you're so busy, you kind of forget. And then you had a moment to step back and you're like, oh, we've actually come a pretty far way. This is kind of crazy.
And given, and that's maybe the last thought, given when you've come so far and how well Yembo is doing, what is the future? Where do you see Yembo in 3 to 5 years, maybe 10 years? And what is the key challenge right now for you?
Yeah, I think if you look at our trajectory, it takes about 5 years to go into a market, digest it, build a product, start it up, and then like be in a situation to kind of think about the next one. So I'd like to kind of like reduce that, but where I see it going is I'd like Yembo to become what every household's inspection begins with. So whether you're moving, whether it's insurance, there's a lot of other industries, a lot of other workflows that we're kind of looking at next. But I think we've identified that it's tedious to be able to get an accurate understanding of what something's going to take. There's a lot of like in-person visits that it takes for even things like remodeling, construction. So being able to help people out, this is generally all of these industries, it's usually a somewhat stressful point in time in your life. Like if you're about to move in 2 weeks, you usually don't have a ton of free time to like sit around and try something new. You're usually pretty busy. So being able to like disproportionately help people at this like time where their life is getting uprooted, they have a lot of change, I feel like is really kind of empowering, gives meaning to the day, where there's someone who you just saved like a couple hours of their day at a time where they're very time poor. And I feel like there's just so many more cool things that can happen kind of coming off of that. So that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. That's why I'm excited. And it's interesting too to see the advancements in AI all across the board. Like I have friends, I have peers, and it's like every industry seems to be going through this grappling right now of like, what do we do about all these changes in technology coming? And everything's kind of up for grabs. So that's what makes it pretty exciting. So it'd be cool to see where things end up. But I haven't seen this anytime before in my career where you can like talk to somebody who works in healthcare or moving or logistics, and everybody is working on AI. It's just it's a really cool time to be alive.
Great. So wish you all the best, Zach, with the next steps. Sounds very interesting. And thanks very much for coming here. I would also encourage all the listeners to check out the book. I can put the book in the description of the podcast when it is ready. And so thanks very much, Zach, for coming, and speak soon.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
And that's it for today's episode of the Startup Huddle. Thank you very much for listening, and make sure to catch all episodes on the startuphuddle.com and follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter for more insights and updates on the world of startups. Thanks again for tuning in.